I want to think today about what happened 80 years ago in the United Kingdom. 80 years ago this year, the Nazi war machine flew over these very skies that we're sitting under and obliterated towns and cities up and down this country. And if it wasn't for a few brave young men, I mean, many of these men were literally 20 or 30 years younger than most of us in this room. And I'm not saying that, please ladies, don't get offended by me saying that. It's just a fact. These were men in their 20s, early 20s, who went up in Spitfires and took on the might of the Nazi war machine. And they defeated that Nazi war machine. And Churchill, after that great victory, made that famous speech where he said, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." And my opinion on the people in this room, now I'm not disrespecting those heroes that literally gave their blood, but today the few are the people sitting in this room. You are actually the few, because you're the ones that get what's happening to this country. You understand what we're facing, you understand the threats, and you're willing to stand up and do something about it, even if it means risking your life and your liberty. And that's something that everybody in this room can be very proud of. To come here today is an act of defiance. To come here today is an act of resistance, and we are the resistance. Because Brexit is not the end. And I'm going to quote Churchill again, it's not the beginning of the end, maybe it's the end of the beginning, but there's a lot of work to do. Brexit is just one step in a long, long march that we've got to go on to basically defeat our enemies. And as Alan's already said very, very eloquently, the people who run our country are treasonous, they're traitors. And I believe that the United Kingdom is actually in more peril now than it was in 1940. And I want to look at some of those threats. I want to think about Islam. And a lot of people, they'll call it radical Islam, they'll try and brush things up. The reality is that the Islamization of the United Kingdom is happening. And there are Islamic supremacists. Now, I'm not saying every single Muslim, we don't mean that, of course we don't mean that. But there are Islamic supremacists in this country who want to overthrow the state. And they're not all just the people strapping suicide vests onto themselves and blowing themselves up or stabbing people on London Bridge. There are people getting into Parliament. The London Fatwa Council has audiences with the Ministers of Defence, with the Ministers of Finance. They're getting into positions of power and they have an agenda. And that agenda is to establish the caliphate right the way throughout Western civilization. And we've seen, in recent years, we've seen the continual push for a blasphemy law. We've seen what's happened to Tommy. If Tommy was talking about any other minority, he would not be getting the grief that he's getting. Tommy has been targeted purely and simply because he is speaking out against the Islamisation of the UK. And I'm not going to call these gangs that are going up and down the country grooming gangs. I've said this before, that's what the ladies go and get groomed when they get their nails done. These gangs that are going up and down this country and attacking, and this is what they're doing, they're attacking little girls. They are jihadist rape gangs. It's a rape jihad. It's in the theology of Islam to do this, and that's a big reason for why they're doing it. It's cultural and it's religious, and the problem that our leaders have and our establishment have is they do not understand fundamentalist religion, and they do not understand that when somebody opens a book and believes that book word for word, that they can do dreadful things in the name of that book. And it's about time our establishment woke up to the real threat of Islam. But the other threat we face is globalism. And the globalists and the Islamic supremacists, they have exactly the same agenda. They want to destroy the nation state. The globalists want to destroy the nation state and impose a supranational state that will control everything. The Islamists want to destroy the nation state and impose a caliphate on the United Kingdom. We're also facing nationalism. Now, a lot of people think Irish nationalism and Scottish nationalism is separate to globalism, but it's not. Because the Irish nationalists and the Scottish nationalists would be quite happy to stay in the EU. They'd be quite happy to stay under the yoke of an undemocratic federalist superstate in Europe. They are driven by a globalist agenda, by a cultural Marxist agenda, and they're also driven by a hatred, I believe, of Britain and a hatred particularly of the English. So they're the threats that we're actually facing. And we see them in every single area of the establishment. We see them in the education system. I was talking to Alan yesterday, he was telling me some horror stories that he'd heard from people in schools in his area where white children are being discriminated against. All the other children in the school were allowed to go on this trip to a university. The only person who wasn't allowed to go on that trip was a white child. And that child was told that they weren't allowed to go purely and simply because they were from a white, affluent background. I was talking to Tony this morning about the experiences that she's had in schools and what's happened to her children. So these things are happening, and they're affecting people in this room right now. I was on a tube yesterday, and there was a school outing on the tube, and the teacher was doing very well at keeping the kids corralled and keeping them sensible. The teacher was a Muslim gentleman. Every single person in that class on that tube looked like they were from a Muslim background, apart from one child who was white. So this is real, this is a reality. And what we need to do, we need to be prophets. We need to be crying out and waking people up to the threat that our nation is undergoing. And we think about Enoch Powell was vilified for what he said when he made the so-called Rivers of Blood speech in the 60s. And let's be honest, some of what Enoch Powell said was racist and it was wrong. There's no doubt about that. He was really, I suppose, classing every person of colour as the same, and that's a totally wrong idea and a wrong attitude to have. But he talked about the River Tiber foaming with blood. That was a prophetic thing that he said there. But it wasn't the River Tiber, it was the River Thames that's been foaming with blood of policemen and soldiers. Yeah. Lee Rigby's blood in the River Thames. Yeah. Wayne Palmer's blood in the River Thames. I'm speaking metaphorically. And literally, some of those victims of those jihadist attacks that were literally run over and tossed into the River Thames when those vans went over those bridges. But of course, who gets the blame? It's Tommy supporters, people that have the guts to speak out against radical Islam. But of course, radical Islam isn't the only problems. There are many other problems that we're facing. And our establishment is rotten. And what worries me is when we get Brexit, and all the people that voted for Boris in the last election, and thankfully we didn't get Corbyn. But I don't think Boris is much better, I'll be quite honest with you. All the people that voted for Boris in the last election in 5 years' time will realise that they have been absolutely betrayed. And they'll be even more angry than they are now. But the problem is, if we don't have a political party by the next general election that we can vote for, that we know genuinely represents our views, and isn't a quisling party like UKIP turned into, a party that genuinely represents our views, we're going to have a huge problem. So we've got a big job to do between now and the next general election. This is what I believe, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of integrity because the guys will throw me off the platform if I try to say I'm not. But I believe that our movement needs a fully functioning political party in every single area of the United Kingdom by the next general election, including branches that are canvassing and doing the business. So how do we do that? First of all, we've got to know what we believe, because this is not a battle that we're going to fight on the streets with baseball bats and guns. That's a fantasy, and it's a dangerous fantasy. This is a battle that can only be fought. Exactly. This is a battle that can only be fought in the sphere of ideas and ideology. That's where all battles are won and lost. And we all know what we're against, but we've got to understand what we believe and what we're for. That's the important thing. So what are we actually for? We've got to look at ourselves and we're going to say, what do we as a movement believe? And if we have a good ideology, we can keep the far-right ethno-nationalist nutjobs out of our movement. We can keep the far left at bay. We can challenge radical Islamists. We can challenge the globalists, and we can challenge the political elite. So I believe that we can identify four things, four principles that we can all get behind. First of all, freedom. Everyone agree with that? Yeah. We can all get behind freedom.
I'll go with that one.
Good. Thank you. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom to go out and challenge whatever you want to challenge. They're British values. It's so important that, like Alan said, that we can go to the pub, and if we want to say something totally outrageous, we can say it. As long as you don't mention hanging Gina Miller. That gets you into a little bit of trouble. I'll pause on that one for a minute. But we should be able to say those things as a joke and as essentially, you know, that's why I put it in this speech will be going on the internet. I know it's going on the internet. I've said that deliberately because I want to see what happens when someone tells a joke. Do you now get prosecuted for telling a joke, whether it's a good joke or a bad joke? So freedom's very, very important. The other thing that I think we can all agree on is equality. Now, not the wacko left interpretation of equality, but the equality that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about. What did he say? That a man or a woman should be judged on the contents of their character and not the colour of their skin. What has happened in the United Kingdom is a complete inversion of racism. The people at the bottom of the tree now are white British people. And I don't say that in a racist way. It's just a fact. It's a fact. We've got to have total equality where it doesn't matter whether you're gay, straight, black, white, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Christian. It doesn't matter. Atheist. I have to say that because Steve's here. And a few others. So we've got to have real equality. We've got to stand and fight for real equality. We've got to defend, I know my time's gone here, we've got to defend democracy. We've got to make sure that when 17.4 million people vote for Brexit, I do not believe that we're going to get a full Brexit. I still believe that Brexit is going to be betrayed. I hope it's not, but that's what I believe. We've got to stand for the sovereignty and structural integrity of the United Kingdom. What do I mean by that? I mean the Scottish Nationalist Party do not get a second referendum. That's the first one. They had one, they blew it to not get another one. Yes, that's right. And even more sinister, and a lot of people in England don't realise this, Boris Johnson, when he did that deal with the EU before the general election, sold out Northern Ireland. He decided to put a border down the Irish Sea. I swim in the Irish Sea almost every day, and I say to the wife, I'm just going for a swim down the border. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that he caved in. And the reason he caved in is because he was scared that the IRA might start bombing and shooting people again. We lived through 50 years of the IRA bombing and shooting people. They were roundly defeated, and then Tony Blair surrendered to them. So we need to defend the structural integrity of the United Kingdom. And what that means is we don't just need to be British patriots, we need to be unionists in the proper sense of the word. And this is not getting involved in any sectarian squabbles that go on in Northern Ireland or even in Scotland. It's not about that. It's about realising that the United Kingdom is the most successful union that there has ever been. It is a real political union that really, really works. And we must stand and we must fight to defend it. So they're the things that we've got to do. So how do we do it? Well, first of all, we start educating each other. We start talking about these things. We start talking about freedom, equality, democracy, sovereignty. We educate our children. We educate our wives. We educate our husbands. We go home and we talk to people until we're sick about this. We do it in the workplace. And we have the guts to stand up and tell people the truth about all of these issues. The next thing we do, when these demonstrations start, and Alan's, I'm not going to give away the plans because they're probably top secret at the minute, but when the plans that Integrity have start taking shape, we as a movement get behind them. One of the problems we've got is there's been so much disunity. There's no reason for disunity. We're not far right, we're not far left, we're just not far wrong, and we've got to stand by that principle, and we've got to stand together. So the DFLA, the veterans, UKIPers, Tommy's people, the South East Division, everybody's got to get together, and we've got to stand together. And people from For Britain as well. We've got to stand together as one group and get behind these protests when they happen. And I believe you me, these protests are going to be spectacular, and they're going to make national news. They're going to be something else. So we need education. We need street protests and protests. And finally, 1,000,000%, as I said at the beginning, we need a political party. Without a political voice, we are just banging our heads off that brick wall. We're going to achieve absolutely nothing. And Enoch Powell said this thing when he closed his speech. He said, "Knowing the things that I know and seeing the things that I see, if I say nothing, that is the greatest betrayal. Let us not be traitors who are betraying our country. Let us be patriots who are standing for our country, who love our country and want to see our country succeed for our children and our grandchildren." Thank you very much.